So this is some quick final thoughts on the on the paradigms and the Myers Walking with the Poor readings. I had talked a little bit about them today during the Skype session, but I just wanted to throw in a couple of other things. So the Jantzi paradigms, if you want to think about them briefly, is really trying to describe the trying to answer the question, what is the source of the problem? Modernization, uh, basically there's three answers to that question. Modernization theory basically says that the source of the problem is something with the individual or the nation itself. It lacks the right infrastructure, it lacks the right attitudes, it lacks the right skills, it lacks the right brain power, it lacks the right culture. Whatever it is, the problem is the poor. The poor themselves are the reason why they're poor. Um, the I've heard this kind of thing many times in Albania because I think Albania national development has primarily been focused on this idea of taking a modernization approach. So, for example, the Sita Gith Europes would be, the chant that was made right after the end of the communist era. They were like, we want to be just like Europe, and we want to develop our infrastructure, we want to develop our schools, we want to develop our attitudes, and that, many times I've heard people say like, ah, ne jemi shqiptar, or oh moi, basically we Albanians, we have bad attitudes, we're stuck, and so that's why we're not progressing, right? Um, Now, it's certainly true that if you look at some of the bureaucracy or corruption, you could say, well, there's bureaucracy and corruption. But the question is, why is there bureaucracy and corruption? Is there something wrong with Albanians, or is there something about other parts of the system that are creating it? A modernization stance would say it's something wrong with the Albanians themselves, to put it crudely. I don't necessarily agree with this, but that would be the main idea behind modernization. In the growth with equity, it has similar things to modernization in the sense of it says that infrastructure, technology, credit, training are all important. But they said the problem is not with poor people or poor countries. The problem is not something wrong with them themselves. It's that they don't have access to, they don't have opportunity to progress. So this one is more like an opportunity, is what you're looking for here. Providing opportunity rather than changing the mentality. If you want to say over here, modernization could be something like mentality change, right? We say we have to change the mentality. The growth of equity says all we have to do is provide an opportunity. The liberation paradigm would basically say that if you're poor, you're being exploited. The reason you're poor is because somebody is taking advantage of you. So the issue is not something wrong with you, and the issue is not providing access or opportunity. The issue is identifying how the exploitation is occurring. So, for example, and let's take back national level Albania. Um, One reason why the nation has not developed much in terms of agricultural development is that so many of the rural families, instead of focusing on developing their own farms, they will often go to Greece or Italy to work because they can get jobs and send money back home. And so this idea, so from Greece and Italy's perspective, it benefits them to have Albanians need to leave the country to go work in, because the Albanians then become a source of cheap labor. Now, Greeks and Italians don't treat Albanians very well, but they benefit from the labor of Albanians. And so if you start to ask the questions of like, why are rural households poor, you might actually have to look at who's benefiting from having poor households. And you might actually be something outside of Albania who is benefiting from having Albania the way it is. Now, I'm not an expert in Albania by any stretch, but I'm just trying to give you a little bit of an idea of how you might use these paradigms to sort of interpret what's going on around you. Now, it's not necessarily that any one is right or wrong, although probably some are more accurate for a context. But what it says is, if you are taking, for example, a modernization approach, then you're going to design programs that deal with changing the poor themselves. If you are taking growth with equity, you are designing programs that are providing opportunity. And if you're taking a liberation perspective, you're looking at how do we overcome exploitation. So the programs you design become very different depending upon which definition you brought to the problem. So some of the handouts I sent out on Skype, I will also send them on email or ask Kayla to send them out to those that weren't on Skype today. The modernization theory, like the types of things you would find an organization doing if it had a modernization approach would be things like, well, obviously building infrastructure, roads, dams, schools, hospitals. You also might find organizations doing adult literacy programs, trying to change the poor themselves. Youth-oriented programs are very, very popular in a modernization program. Big Brothers Big Sisters is an organization in the United States. The organization I used to work for in Bolivia actually had a program for street children. Hopefully this sounds a little bit familiar to some of you. But it's really around youth-oriented programs, because you're trying to change the youth, to change their mentality so that they become modern. Right now, I'm not saying it's bad to have youth programs. I'm just saying it's a very modernization type of approach. You might also provide scholarships for people to study in the United States or Europe, where the modern schools are. And foreign personnel often play key roles in the programs. So World Vision, in a way, is a very modernization organization, if you think about it. The organization may use the term capacity building. This is a very modernization term. So if you hear people using the term capacity building or transferring technology or adapting innovation, then you're probably thinking about a modernization type of organization. Growth with equity has similar ideas of infrastructure, technology, education, and credit, but they tend to do what I would call contextual technology or intermediate technology. So instead of having the big modern electrical grid, you might promote solar panels to allow people way off the grid to have access to electricity. You might instead of having nice mechanized agriculture, you might promote simple contour farming. You'd focus on clinics. So the idea is you're trying to decentralize services, and you're trying to provide opportunity, microcredit and microfinance programs, small business, community rotating loans. All of these kinds of things would be very growth with equity, providing opportunity for people to get into the workplace. You tend to have a very strong emphasis on local context, and the words in the program tend to be things like decentralization, regionalizing, providing access, giving opportunity, training to some extent. So that would be more of a growth with equity organization. Liberation would, well, I have this whole story of strangler figs I'm not going to go into because it'd be very long. But basically it's looking at how do you change power differences, because it's the extreme power differences create extractive structures, create exploitation. So if you reduce power differences, you reduce exploitation. So things like creating a social consciousness, helping people see their reality. These are very popular terms in Latin America, where you look at how are you being exploited. Right, so when they say see the reality, they mean see the reality of how you might be taking advantage of. You form mass organizations, social movements. You engage in union organizing. Not you, but I mean if you're an organization that works in this type of thing. you organize cultural pride movements to basically you're trying to create groups that have high solidarity so that they can balance out power. Now, one thing I say is that a liberation approach tends to decentralize power, whereas a growth with equity approach tries to decentralize services. An organization that has this framework would tend to use words like liberation, oppression, advocacy, solidarity. So there would be sort of a more this idea of justice rather than development. Now, liberation organizations are relatively scarce. If you look at all of the thousands of organizations that exist in development, probably only about 10% might have a liberation orientation, right? And one of the reasons is that the funding just isn't there. Although many people might have this as an interpretation, there's a lot more funding available for modernization or growth with equity types of programs than there is for liberation. So that's one reason why there's relatively few. So it's not that this is incorrect. In fact, I think it's probably the most accurate definition of what's happening. But it is one of the it's just not as common in development world. Okay, so that just some thoughts. You have this handout, and I would encourage you to look over it. But just some thoughts on the paradigms again, just to sort of rethink, help you think some of that. Now, the other thing, one of the other things that I liked about Myers, the Walking with the Poor, that I did get to talk about was this idea of, I think some of you wrote about it in your papers, the poor are survivors. And I was just thinking, like, we don't normally in World Vision talk about the poor in that way. We tend to talk about the poor as being helpless or disadvantaged. We don't tend to think of them as survivors or hardened core veterans. So, for me, it really came home to me when I worked in Bolivia about 20 years ago. This is a picture of me from many years ago. 20 years ago. I was working for an organization that, and I was based in the middle of the Bolivian jungle. So I was in a small village of about 22 families. This was the hut that I lived in. So very, highland tropical. I mean, not high, very tropical jungle environment, bamboo huts, so forth. That was my mountain bike behind there, and I was put out there. I was a young guy back then, relatively young. And I was put out there to basically build the capacity of the people of the village. And I remember, so I kind of went in there with this little bit of an attitude, a little bit of that God complex that Myers talked about, sort of seeing the poor as helpless, seeing myself as sort of the person who could provide the expertise that they needed. One day, this area was very sort of flooded lowlands, so big, rivers like this, jungle, swamp, a lot of swamp. This is a picture of myself again with another woman from the organization. So this would be very typical sort of swampy countryside, thorn trees here. You see that there's thorns up and down these trees and so forth. Oh, by the way, this is a picture of my wife from 20 years ago. She was also working out here in this area, and this sort of typical road, typical motorcycle. I got a mountain bike. She had her motorcycle, so I'm not jealous about that. Anyway, so I'm living out in this village, and one day the farmers say, Terry, can you come and help us? We are going to cut the boundary lines for our village, and we have to go cut back into the jungle, sort of to clear out, sort of to delineate where our village lands are. And can you help us, managing the compass, right? So I was going, oh yeah, sure, I can manage a compass. I can help direct where the boundary line should go. So we would set off a group of about 20 farmers and myself with machetes, and we went out into the back areas of the village lands. which looked a lot like this. Um, and this is a very mild picture, but I was trying to sort of show the context. But we got back into these sort of deep swamps that basically, there was this deep muck that would fall, that I would step into and go up to my waist, and I would try to pull myself out, and I would have to grab these trees that had thorns on them, and my hands would get all cut up, and then I would take another step, and I would fall into the muck again. The farmers knew kind of how to step to avoid the deep muck, but I didn't. I didn't have that skill, and I kept falling into the muck. The short answer of the story, or the short end of the story, was that basically the farmers had to practically carry me out of the swamp. I almost died back there. One point I was just collapsed against a tree, thinking, I'm never going to make it. I'm never going to make it out of here. I'm just going to die back here. And so the farmers ended up pulling me out of the swamp. And for myself, this was a very sort of, I mean, it's kind of a funny story, but it's also a very keen reminder to me, because I was thinking when I was back in my hut that night, here I was, the sort of the expert who has come to capacity build them, and I was like, this is the context where these people had settled. They'd moved in from the highlands into these lowland jungle areas, and all they had was like a machete. And I said, you put one of these farmers down in the middle of this kind of swampy area with a machete, and a month later, they have a house set up. It might look like this, but it's a house. They're growing things. They have a garden. They're surviving. And I said, if you put me out there in that swamp with a machete, a month later, I would be dead. And I was like, and yet somehow I was supposed to be telling them how to live, right? So for really, it brought home to me that these were farmers. These were people who learned how to survive. They were survivors in a really rough, difficult context. And it really shifted the way that I thought about the people that I worked with. That instead of thinking of them as helpless, poor, or lacking capacity, I was forced to think of them as hardened survivors who had overcome extreme difficulty. Maybe they didn't have the fancy mansions, but they weren't dead. And this was one of the things that Myers said in one of in the chapter about the poor. He was like, poor people can't be stupid, cannot afford to be stupid, because stupid people die when you're in a high sort of risk environment. Rich people can afford to be stupid because they're protected by their wealth. And so he was really trying to talk about this as sort of this idea of survivors. So anyway, that was another sort of point that I wanted. So the three things from Myers that I thought were really important were that idea of the ongoing story. That's not the organization story. The community has a story that extends beyond the organization. That the God complex, and then also this idea of thinking of the poor as survivors of a difficult environment, rather than helpless or incapable. And it really shifted the way that I thought about people that I worked with as a result. All right, that's it for final notes. My next video lectures will be on Corton, the upcoming readings, and so forth.